The dim glow of oil lamps casts flickering shadows across the silk-draped tent. The air is thick with the scent of incense, curling in slow, hypnotic waves. Across the table, the gypsy fortune-teller turns over the final card. Silence stretches between them, heavy and unyielding before her voice cuts through the stillness. If you choose the wrong bride, Pharaoh, your empire will crumble, and so will you. Kyle exhales a quiet laugh, amused, unshaken. He has never feared fate, nor the whispers of the gods. But as the days pass and the prophecy takes shape before his eyes, a chilling truth settles within him. The only woman who can save him is the one he was never meant to love. The air in the royal chamber hung thick with incense, swirling in lazy patterns that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the alabaster screens. Pharaoh Kale sat upon his golden throne, shoulders squared beneath the weight of the double crown of Egypt. At 35, his face still held the sharp, handsome features that had made him the desire of many noblewomen throughout the kingdom, though fine lines had begun to form at the corners of his eyes, testament to the burden of ruling the most powerful civilization along the Nile. "Your Magnificence," announced the chamberlain with a deep bow, "the seer from the southern lands awaits your pleasure." Kale nodded, his fingers drumming against the arm of his throne. He hadn't requested a fortune-teller's presence, but his sister Neferet had insisted. "Your 30th year of rule approaches, brother," she'd said that morning, her kohl-rimmed eyes serious. "The stars must be read, the omens interpreted. Egypt needs stability, and that means you need a queen." A woman appeared in the doorway and Kale's drumming fingers stilled. She wasn't what he'd expected. No flowing robes or elaborate headdress marked her as one of the temple oracles. Instead, she wore simple linen, dyed the color of the river at sunset. Copper bangles encircled her wrists, tinkling softly as she moved. Her skin was the warm brown of someone who lived beneath the sun rather than sheltered in palace shadows. "You stand before Pharaoh Kale, living Horus, Lord of the Two Lands," intoned the chamberlain. "Approach and kneel." The woman walked forward with grace that belied her common appearance. Her eyes, a startling amber, met the pharaoh's directly, something no subject dared do without permission. "I kneel only to the gods," she said, her voice low and melodious, "and even they do not always deserve it." Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Guards stepped forward, spears at the ready, but Kyle raised a hand to stop them. Intrigued despite himself, he leaned forward. "You've got guts. I'll give you that," he said, with a half smile. "Tell me your name, bold one." "I am Naya." She shifted the small leather pouch hanging from her belt. "I read what is written in the stars, in the sand, in the hearts of men. And what brings you to my palace, uninvited?" "The same winds that bring the falcon before the storm," she replied. "I come with words that must be spoken, whether they are welcomed or not." Kyle reclined in his throne, amusement flickering across his face. Court life was suffocating in its predictability. This woman, at least, offered something different. "Speak then, Naya of the southern lands. What do your omens tell you?" She reached into her pouch, extracting a handful of small carved stones. Without ceremony, she cast them onto the polished floor before his throne. They clattered and spun, settling into a pattern that meant nothing to Kale, but caused Naya's expression to darken. "A choice stands before you, great pharaoh," she said, kneeling to study the stones. "One that will determine not just your fate, but the fate of all Egypt." "Go on." His amusement was fading, replaced by a strange unease. "You will take a wife soon." Her fingers hovered over a particular stone marked with a crescent moon. "This has already been decided by those who believe they know what's best for Egypt." Kyle's eyes narrowed. The negotiations with the House of Amunet regarding Lady Alara weren't common knowledge outside the palace walls. "If you follow the path laid out for you, if you marry where duty dictates, I see only darkness ahead." Naya gathered up her stones, closing her fist around them tightly. "Your dynasty will crumble like sand. The glory of Egypt will fade. The Nile itself will weep." "How dare you!" The high priest Ramesses stepped forward from the shadows where he'd been observing. His tall frame trembled with indignation. "Such treasonous words in the presence of the living Horus." Kyle raised his hand again, though his own jaw had tightened at the woman's audacity. "And what alternative do you see in your stones, Naya?" She met his gaze unflinchingly. "A different bride, one not chosen by councils and priests, one whose heart beats in rhythm with yours. Find her, and Egypt will flourish for 1,000 years under your line." "Ridiculous superstition," Ramesses spat. "This woman is clearly an agitator, perhaps sent by enemies in the northern territories to sow discord. Naya stood, tucking her stones back into their pouch. I speak only what is revealed to me. The choice remains yours, great pharaoh. She bowed her head slightly, the barest acknowledgement of his station. But know this, destinies intertwine in ways even the gods cannot always predict. Sometimes the stars themselves must be rewritten. Something in her words, or perhaps the certainty with which she spoke them, sent a chill down Kale's spine. He'd heard prophecies before, of course. Every ruler had sycophants eager to predict glory and long life, but never had anyone dared to speak of ruin in his presence. "You've said your piece," he said coldly. "Now leave before I reconsider my patience." Naya turned to go, her bangles chiming softly with each step. At the chamber entrance, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. "When the moon swallows the sun and darkness falls at midday, remember my words, Pharaoh Kale. Remember, and choose wisely." Then she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of jasmine and the uneasy silence of the court. "Shall I have her followed, your magnificence?" asked the captain of the guard, his hand already on his sword hilt. "Arrested for her insolence?" Kyle waved dismissively. "Let her go. She's just a simple fortune teller trying to make herself seem important." But even as he spoke the words, he didn't quite believe them. Later that evening, as the stars emerged in the vast Egyptian sky, Kyle stood on his private balcony, overlooking the sacred river. The woman's prophecy tumbled through his mind, despite his best efforts to dismiss it. "Trouble's sleeping brother." Neferet appeared beside him, her silken robes whispering against the stone floor. "I heard about the scene with the fortune teller today." "Just another charlatan?" Kyle murmured, though the conviction in his voice was lacking. Neferet studied his profile in the moonlight. "Perhaps, but they say sometimes the gods speak through unlikely vessels. You sound like you believe her nonsense." "I believe in being cautious. Lady Alara arrives next week for the festival. The council expects you to announce your betrothal before the new moon." She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's a good match, Kale. Her family's connections to the Eastern kingdoms will strengthen our trade routes. And she's said to be both beautiful and accomplished." Kyle nodded absently. All that was true. Everything about the match was sensible, practical, politically advantageous. So why did the fortune teller's words linger like storm clouds on the horizon? "It will be as the gods will it," he said finally, the traditional phrase falling from his lips more out of habit than conviction. But as his sister left him to his thoughts, Kale couldn't shake the image of those amber eyes, so direct and fearless, or the absolute certainty in Naya's voice as she spoke of Egypt's ruin. In the distance, a jackal howled, the sound echoing across the desert, like laughter from the realm of Anubis himself. And for the first time in many years, Pharaoh Kale, living Horus and Lord of the Two Lands, felt the cold finger of fear trace its way down his spine as he wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, destiny was not as fixed as he had always believed. The royal council chamber buzzed with tension as 7 of Egypt's most powerful men argued in hushed, urgent tones. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows, illuminating dust motes that danced above the polished cedar table like restless spirits. At the head sat High Priest Ramesses, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching as the treasurer and the military commander nearly came to blows. "Gentlemen," Ramesses finally said, his deep voice cutting through the chaos like a knife, "this bickering serves no one, least of all Egypt." He rose to his full impressive height, gold and lapis lazuli gleaming at his throat. "Our purpose today is singular, to ensure Pharaoh announces his betrothal to Lady Alara at the upcoming festival." Vizier Amenhotep, whose wizened face had witnessed the rise and fall of 2 pharaohs before Kale, cleared his throat. "The signs from yesterday's incident trouble me deeply. This Gypsy woman, her words seem to have affected our king." "Nonsense," snapped Ramesses. "A momentary disruption, nothing more." Pharaoh dismissed her ravings. "Did he?" The old vizier's rheumy eyes narrowed. "Then why did he spend the night pacing his chambers rather than sleeping? Why did he cancel this morning's audience with the Amunet delegation?" A heavy silence fell upon the chamber. Each man present understood the delicate balance of power that kept Egypt prosperous, and how easily that balance could tip if Pharaoh began questioning the council's carefully laid plans. "What exactly did this fortune teller say?" asked General Jabari, whose scarred hands rested on the pommel of his ceremonial sword. Ramesses' lips thinned. "Treasonous superstition. She claimed disaster would befall Egypt if Pharaoh married where duty dictates." The treasurer, Nacht, rubbed his temple. "The common folk love such mystical nonsense. If word spreads, it won't, Ramesses cut in sharply. I've already dispatched men to find this Naya and ensure her silence. And if Pharaoh discovers this? Vizier Amenhotep's voice was soft but pointed. The high priest waved a bejeweled hand dismissively. He need never know. Our concern must be securing the alliance with Amunet. Lady Alara brings not only her family's vast wealth and Eastern trade connections, but the possibility of a strong male heir. His gaze swept the table. Unless someone here believes Egypt would be better served by a different match, no one spoke. They all knew the careful calculations that had gone into selecting Lady Alara as Egypt's future queen. Then we are agreed. Ramesses nodded with satisfaction. Now, to the practical matters of ensuring Pharaoh fulfills his duty. In her private chambers within the east wing of the palace, Lady Alara of Amunet stood motionless as 3 handmaidens fluttered around her, making final adjustments to her formal attire. At 22, she possessed the kind of beauty poets immortalized in verse. Skin like polished ivory, eyes the deep blue of lapis lazuli, lips naturally tinted the color of pomegranates. Her slender frame was now adorned in the finest linen Egypt could produce, so sheer it seemed to float around her like morning mist. The golden collar sits too high, critiqued her mother, Lady Senbi, circling like a hawk. It must showcase her neck. Pharaoh should see exactly what awaits him in the marriage bed. Ilara's expression remained carefully neutral, though her fingers twitched almost imperceptibly. 6 months of preparation had led to this moment. Lessons in court etiquette, the proper way to address the royal family, how to walk, talk, and even breathe like Egypt's future queen. Her father had negotiated the match for years, dangling trade routes and military support before the council until they finally agreed. Remember, Lady Senbi continued, fussing with a lock of Ilara's midnight black hair, this dinner is merely a formality. The council has already secured Pharaoh's agreement. You need only smile, speak when spoken to, and display the grace befitting your future station. Yes, mother, Ilara replied, the words as practiced as her posture. Such a fortunate girl, her mother sighed, stepping back to admire the final effect. Queen of the mightiest kingdom on earth. Your children will rule after Pharaoh Kale passes to the field of reeds. Your name will be carved in stone for eternity. One of the handmaidens, Meret, a quiet girl who'd served Ilara since childhood, caught her eye in the polished bronze mirror. Alone among those present, she could see the momentary flash of panic behind her mistress's perfect composure. What of Pharaoh himself? Ilara asked, surprising even herself with the question. What manner of man is he? Lady Senbi blinked, genuinely confused by the question's relevance. He is Pharaoh, she said, as if that explained everything. After a moment's thought, she added, they say he's handsome enough, though nearing 40, strong, respected by his generals. What more could matter? Whether he has kind eyes, Ilara thought but didn't say, whether he laughs easily or rules with a heavy hand, whether I might find some small measure of happiness as his queen. Nothing, mother, she murmured instead. I was merely curious. A sharp knock at the chamber door interrupted them. Lady Senbi clapped her hands, shooing away the handmaidens. Enter! A palace official stepped into the room and bowed deeply. Lady Alara, Lady Senbi, I come with a message from the royal chamberlain. Pharaoh requests a private audience with Lady Alara before tonight's feast. Lady Senbi's eyes widened with delight. Wonderful! Such an honor. When? Immediately, my lady. The royal barge awaits to take her to the Temple of Hathor, where Pharaoh is completing the afternoon rituals. Ilara felt her heart leap into her throat. This wasn't part of the plan. Private audiences weren't given to unmarried women, even those of noble birth. Something had changed. Her mother, oblivious to protocol in her excitement, was already rushing to gather Ilara's formal headdress. The Temple of Hathor, how fitting. The goddess of love and marriage. This is a most auspicious sign. The palace official coughed discreetly. If I may, Lady Senbi, Pharaoh specified that Lady Alara should come without an entourage. He wishes to speak with her alone. Lady Senbi froze. Alone? But that's not... Mother, Ilara interrupted softly, seeing an unexpected opportunity. It would be discourteous to question Pharaoh's wishes. But I will go, Ilara said, a new firmness in her voice. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt a flutter of something like hope. Whatever Pharaoh wanted to discuss, at least it would be her own ears hearing it, not filtered through her parents or the council. The royal barge glided across the Nile like a waterbird, its gilded prow cutting through the late afternoon light. Ilara sat beneath a canopy of fine linen, her eyes fixed on the approaching shoreline where the majestic Temple of Hathor rose against the desert backdrop. Its massive columns, carved with the face of the cow-eared goddess, seemed to watch her approach with ancient, knowing eyes. As the barge docked, a small party of priests waited to escort her. Ilara took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped onto Egyptian soil for the first time in her life. "Welcome, Lady Ilara," said the eldest priest with a bow. "Pharaoh awaits you in the inner sanctuary." She followed silently, trying to absorb every detail of her surroundings. The towering columns inscribed with hieroglyphs, the brilliantly painted scenes of gods and pharaohs on the walls, the sweet smell of incense that perfumed the air. This would be her homeland now. These strange gods, her patrons and protectors. At the entrance to the inner sanctuary, the priest stopped and gestured for her to continue alone. Heart pounding beneath her golden collar, Ilara stepped through the doorway into semi-darkness. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust. The sanctuary was illuminated only by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows across walls covered in sacred imagery. At the center stood a life-sized statue of Hathor, arms outstretched in welcome, her cow-eared face serene and knowing, but Pharaoh was nowhere to be seen. "My lady seems disappointed," came a deep voice from behind her. Ilara turned quickly, instinctively dropping into a perfect court curtsy. "Great Pharaoh, Lord of the Two Lands, I am honored by your invitation." "Rise," Kyle said, stepping from the shadows, "and look at me." She obeyed, raising her eyes to his face for the first time. The stories hadn't exaggerated his appearance. He was indeed handsome, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes. But there was something else there too, something the court gossips hadn't mentioned. A profound weariness etched into the lines around his mouth and eyes. "Do you know why I've brought you here, Lady Ilara?" he asked, circling her slowly. She kept her face composed, though her heart raced. "I presume to make your final assessment before announcing our betrothal, Your Magnificence." Kyle stopped his circling, his expression unreadable. "That is what the council expects, yes." He moved to stand directly before her, close enough that she could smell the cedar oil in his hair. "Tell me, my lady, do you wish to be Egypt's queen?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked what she wished. She began, then faltered, unsure what answer he sought. "The truth, if you please," he said quietly. "We are alone here, save for Hathor herself." He nodded toward the statue. "And she is the goddess of truth as well as love." Something in his tone, a hint of genuine curiosity rather than mere formality, gave Ilara courage. "I wish to fulfill my duty to my family and my people," she said carefully. "The alliance between Amunet and Egypt will bring prosperity to both our lands." "A diplomatic answer," Kyle noted, a flicker of disappointment crossing his features. "Exactly what your parents taught you to say, I imagine." Ilara felt a flash of unexpected irritation. "What would you have me say, Great Pharaoh? That I've dreamed since childhood of being your bride? We are both aware this is a political arrangement. Neither of us has the luxury of marrying for other reasons." To her surprise, Kyle laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face, briefly erasing the weariness. "There she is," he said softly. "I wondered if there was a real woman beneath all that courtly training." Ilara blushed, realizing she'd spoken far too boldly. "Forgive me, No," he interrupted, raising a hand. "Don't retreat back into formality. I find I prefer honesty to protocol, at least in private." He turned away from her, moving to stand before Hathor's statue. "Tell me, Lady Ilara, do you believe in prophecies?" The abrupt change of subject bewildered her. "Prophecies, Your Magnificence? Omens, fortunes, messages from the gods delivered through mortal lips." Ilara considered her answer carefully. "In Amunet, we consult the oracle before any significant decision. My father would never negotiate a trade agreement without first seeking divine guidance." "And do these oracles always speak the truth?" "They speak what the gods wish us to hear," she replied. "Whether we correctly interpret their messages is another matter entirely." Kyle turned back to her, studying her face with new interest. A thoughtful answer. "And what if an oracle foretold disaster? Should you and I wed? Would you still fulfill your duty then?" Ilara felt suddenly cold, despite the warm evening air. Something had happened, something beyond her knowledge that had brought her to this strange meeting. "Has such a prophecy been made?" she asked directly. For a long moment, Kyle didn't answer. Then he sighed, seeming to come to some decision. "Forgive me, my lady. I've spoken inappropriately." His formal tone returned, the brief glimpse of the man behind the crown now hidden once more. The hour grows late. We should return to the palace for the feast. As they walked from the sanctuary, Elara sensed that some crucial moment had passed, that she had been measured against some unknown standard and somehow found wanting, not in beauty or grace or political value, but in something else entirely, something neither her mother's lessons nor her father's ambitions had prepared her for. And as the royal barge carried them back across the darkening waters toward the palace lights, she couldn't help but wonder what fate awaited her in this strange land of ancient gods and mysterious prophecies, and whether the man who would be her husband was having second thoughts about their carefully arranged future. The great hall of Pharaoh's palace blazed with the light of 1,000 oil lamps, their flames reflected in golden surfaces that adorned every pillar and wall. Servants moved like shadows between the gathered nobility, refilling goblets with wine from the royal vineyards and offering platters heaped with delicacies from every corner of the kingdom. The air hung heavy with perfume, incense, and the sweet notes of harps and flutes played by musicians partially hidden behind potted papyrus plants. In the center of it all, seated upon a raised dais, Pharaoh Kale presided over the feast with the stiff formality expected of Egypt's living god. His double crown had been exchanged for a lighter coronet more suitable for dining, but the weight pressing down on him had nothing to do with gold or precious stones. "Your magnificence seems distracted this evening," murmured Vizier Amenhotep from his position at Kyle's right hand. "Is the entertainment not to your liking?" Kyle's gaze drifted across the hall to where dancers swirled in synchronized movements, their lithe bodies telling the story of Isis and Osiris through gesture and expression. Under normal circumstances, he might have appreciated their skill, but tonight every beat of the drums felt like another step toward an inescapable fate. "The dancers are exemplary," he replied, lifting his wine cup to his lips without drinking, "as is everything else that has been arranged." The old vizier's eyes, cloudy with age but still sharp with intelligence, studied his pharaoh's profile. "Perhaps it is the company that fails to engage you." Kyle followed Amenhotep's subtle glance toward the place of honor to his left, where Lady Elara sat in silent perfection. Since their strange meeting at the Temple of Hathor 2 days prior, she had been the model of propriety, speaking when spoken to, smiling graciously at every introduction, displaying flawless knowledge of Egyptian court customs. Yet something about her careful performance rang as hollow to him as his own. "Lady Elara is everything her family promised," Kale said neutrally. "Egypt is fortunate to welcome such an accomplished noblewoman." Amenhotep's wrinkled face creased further with a knowing smile. "Indeed, and yet?" "And yet?" Kyle turned to him sharply. "Forgive an old man's presumption, great pharaoh, but I have served the throne since before your birth. I recognize the look of a man contemplating his cage, no matter how gilded its bars." Kyle stared at his vizier, momentarily startled by the unexpected perception. Before he could respond, High Priest Ramesses approached the dais and bowed deeply. "Great Pharaoh, the hour approaches for your announcement," Ramesses said, his resonant voice carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "The nobility of both Egypt and Amunet await your words with great anticipation." Kale felt something tighten in his chest. For 30 years he had fulfilled every expectation placed upon him as Egypt's ruler. He had led successful military campaigns, expanded trade routes, built monuments to the gods, and ensured the Nile's bounty was properly managed and distributed. Not once had he questioned the path set before him by tradition and duty, until now. "The hour approaches," he agreed, setting down his wine cup with deliberate care. "But it has not yet arrived. I find I need air before addressing the court. Excuse me." He rose, and instantly the entire hall fell silent, hundreds of eyes turning toward their pharaoh. Ignoring the startled expressions of both Ramesses and Amenhotep, Kale descended from the dais and moved through the crowd, which parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. No one dared speak as he passed, though he could feel the weight of their stares, questioning, concerned, perhaps even disapproving. At the far end of the hall, massive cedar doors opened onto a moonlit terrace overlooking the palace gardens. Kyle stepped outside, breathing deeply of the night air, fragrant with lotus blossoms, and free from the cloying perfumes of the nobility. "Leave me," he commanded the guards who had automatically moved to follow him. After a moment's hesitation, they bowed and retreated to positions just inside the doors, leaving him alone beneath the vast Egyptian sky. Or so he thought. "They're watching you, you know," came a soft voice from the shadows, Every noble in that hall is counting the minutes until you return and fulfill their expectations. Kyle spun around, hand automatically reaching for a dagger no longer at his belt. It wasn't proper for Pharaoh to be armed at a feast. His eyes narrowed as a figure stepped into the moonlight. "Lady Alara," he said, relaxing slightly. "You startled me." She smiled, and for the first time since her arrival, the expression seemed genuine rather than practiced. "Forgive me. I followed when I saw you leave. I thought perhaps we might speak honestly again, as we did in the temple." Kyle studied her with new interest. In the moonlight, away from the formal setting of the feast, she appeared younger, more vulnerable, less the perfect diplomatic bride and more a woman caught in circumstances beyond her control, not unlike himself. "You risk your reputation by seeking a private audience," he observed. "Your mother would be scandalized. My mother would sacrifice me to Set himself if it secured this alliance," Alara replied with surprising bitterness. Then, seeming to catch herself, she added more formally, "Forgive my impertinence, Your Magnificence." "No," Kyle said quickly. "Please, speak freely. I find I've had enough of court formalities to last several lifetimes." Alara hesitated, then moved to stand beside him at the terrace balustrade. For a moment they simply stood in silence, looking out over the sleeping gardens where fountains murmured quietly beneath the stars. "May I ask you something, Lady Alara?" Kyle finally said. "Something no diplomat would dare ask?" She turned to him, her blue eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Of course. Are you afraid?" The directness of the question seemed to surprise her. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then finally answered with quiet honesty. "Every day of my life." Something twisted in Kyle's chest. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. For all the differences in their positions, they shared this fundamental reality. Lives mapped out by others, paths chosen without their consent. "What frightens you most?" he asked softly. Ilara's gaze dropped to her hands, which gripped the stone balustrade tightly. "That I will live and die without ever having truly lived at all. That I will perform my role perfectly. Dutiful daughter, political bride, royal consort, mother to the next pharaoh, and none of it will have anything to do with who I really am." She looked up suddenly, her expression pinched with embarrassment. "I shouldn't have said that. It's childish, selfish." "No," Kyle interrupted. "It's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in years." A moment of understanding passed between them, brief but profound. Then Alara straightened her shoulders, the perfect court posture returning like armor. "They will be looking for you," she said. "The announcement?" "Yes, the announcement." Kyle turned back toward the great hall, where hundreds waited for him to formalize the arrangement that would bind this woman to him for life. A perfectly suitable match in every political sense. And yet, "You asked about prophecies at the temple," Alara said quietly. "You never told me why." Kyle hesitated. How could he explain his encounter with Nile, the strange effect her words had on him, the growing sense that he stood at a crossroads more significant than any he had faced before? "There was a fortune teller," he began, then stopped abruptly as a new figure appeared in the terrace doorway. "Great Pharaoh," High Priest Ramesses called, his voice tight with barely concealed impatience. "The court grows restless. It is time." Kyle nodded stiffly. "I will be there momentarily." Ramesses' gaze flickered to Alara, his eyes narrowing with suspicion, but he merely bowed and withdrew. "We must go," Alara said, already moving toward the doors. "Separately, I think. I'll slip back through the side entrance. It wouldn't do for us to appear together." "No," Kyle agreed. "It wouldn't do at all." As she turned to leave, he found himself catching her wrist. She looked back at him, startled. "Lady Alara," he said quietly, "if you could choose, what would you choose?" Her face softened momentarily with something like regret. "We weren't born to choose, Your Magnificence, only to fulfill our duties as best we can." She gently extracted her wrist from his grasp and slipped away into the shadows. Kyle stood alone for another moment, feeling the walls of his gilded cage closing in around him. With a deep breath, he squared his shoulders and returned to the great hall. The crowd parted once more as he made his way back to the dais. He could feel the anticipation in the air, thick as incense smoke. Every face turned toward him expectantly, the Egyptian nobility eager to see their pharaoh fulfill his duty, the Amunet delegation waiting for the alliance to be formalized, the priests watching with calculating eyes to ensure tradition was upheld. As he took his seat, Kyle noticed Lady Alara had indeed returned to her place, her composure perfect once more. No one would guess that moments ago she had spoken of fear and regret beneath the moon. High Priest Ramesses stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. "Noble lords and ladies of Egypt and Amunet," he intoned, his voice echoing through the vast hall. "On this most auspicious night, as the stars align in favorable conjunction, our great pharaoh, living Horus and lord of the two lands, will make an announcement that ensures Egypt's prosperity for generations to come." The hall fell completely silent, hundreds holding their breath in anticipation. Ramesses turned toward Kyle, gesturing for him to rise and speak the words that would set his future in stone. Kyle stood, feeling the weight of every expectant gaze. Lady Alara beside him, her eyes downcast in perfect modesty, Vizier Amenhotep watching him with that knowing, sympathetic gaze, General Jabari already calculating the military advantages of the Amunet alliance, Lady Senbi practically vibrating with triumph that her daughter would be Egypt's queen, all waiting for him to play his part in this elaborately choreographed dance that had been arranged without his heart's consent. He opened his mouth to speak the traditional phrases, the formal declaration of intent to take Lady Alara as his royal consort. The words were there, memorized and ready. Simple words that would fulfill his duty to Egypt, maintain the political balance, and ensure his dynasty's continuance. Yet as he prepared to utter them, unbidden came the memory of amber eyes meeting his without fear, of a voice speaking of choices and destinies rewritten, of prophecies that warned of disaster. "Find her, and Egypt will flourish for 1,000 years under your line." Who was this her the fortune-teller had spoken of? Could it possibly be the woman beside him now? Or someone else entirely? Someone he had yet to meet? "Great Pharaoh," prompted Ramesses when the silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Your announcement?" Kyle looked out at the sea of faces, none of them seeing him. Not truly. They saw only Pharaoh, the living embodiment of Horus, a figurehead to be manipulated and directed for their own purposes. Never the man beneath the crown who might have his own desires, his own fears. For the first time in his life, Pharaoh Kale felt the true enormity of his imprisonment, not by enemies or physical bonds, but by tradition, expectation, and the relentless machinery of state. And in that moment, something rebellious awoke within him, something that whispered of possibilities beyond the narrow path he had always walked. "Noble lords and ladies," he began, his voice steady despite the sudden racing of his heart. "On this auspicious night, I wish to announce—" He paused, feeling the entire room lean forward in anticipation, unaware that their pharaoh stood on the precipice of a decision that would change not just his fate, but perhaps the fate of Egypt itself. That we shall extend the festival by 3 more days to properly honor our guests from Amunet." A collective gasp rippled through the great hall, followed by confused murmurs. This was not the announcement anyone had expected. High Priest Ramesses stood frozen beside the dais, his mouth slightly open, clearly caught off guard. Kale kept his expression neutral as he continued. "Let us use this time to strengthen the bonds between our great kingdoms through shared celebration and cultural exchange. Tonight, we feast and make merry. Official matters of state can wait until the festival's conclusion." He raised his golden cup high, "to friendship between Egypt and Amunet." After a moment's stunned hesitation, the court raised their cups in response, though the confused glances exchanged throughout the hall spoke volumes. Kale resumed his seat, purposefully avoiding Ramesses' thunderous gaze. "What game are you playing, Your Magnificence?" the high priest whispered fiercely as the musicians hastily began playing again. "The stars are aligned for the announcement tonight. The omens can surely wait 3 more days," Kyle replied smoothly. "Unless you believe the gods are so impatient, they cannot grant their pharaoh a few days of reflection before such a momentous decision." Before Ramesses could respond, Kyle turned to Lady Alara, whose perfect composure had faltered just enough for him to glimpse genuine surprise in her eyes. "I hope you will forgive the extended festivities, my lady," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I wish for you to experience all the wonders Egypt has to offer before we proceed with formal matters." "Of course, Your Magnificence," she replied, quickly regaining her diplomatic poise. "Your hospitality honors Amunet." But in the brief moment their eyes met, Kale saw something else there. A flicker of relief, perhaps even gratitude. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Lady Alara was as trapped by this arrangement as he was. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced merriment, with the court desperately trying to interpret Pharaoh's unexpected announcement. Had he found some flaw in the proposed alliance? Was he testing the Amunet delegation's patience? Or was there some deeper political strategy at work that only Pharaoh himself understood? None guessed the truth, that for the first time in his reign, Kale had acted on impulse rather than calculation. He had bought himself time, though for what purpose he wasn't entirely sure. Hours later, when the feast had finally wound down and the palace had grown quiet, Kyle paced his private chambers like a caged lion. Sleep eluded him, his mind racing with the implications of his actions. By morning, the council would have regrouped, strategized, and prepared arguments to pressure him back onto the predetermined path. He moved to the balcony, gazing out at the sleeping city spread below the palace walls. Beyond the grand temples and noble residences lay the heart of Memphis, the craftsmen's quarters, markets, and humble dwellings where ordinary Egyptians lived lives unencumbered by the weight of divine responsibility. A sudden wild thought seized him. What if for one night he could escape? Not just the palace walls, but the very identity that had defined and confined him since birth. Almost before he'd consciously decided, Kyle moved to a cedar chest hidden behind an ornate screen. From its depths, he withdrew items he'd kept from his younger days. Simple linen garments, a plain cloak, sandals worn not by royalty, but by common merchants. Garments he'd once used for incognito inspections of the city in his early reign, before the pressures of court had overwhelmed such personal initiatives. He dressed quickly, heart pounding with the recklessness of his plan. Leaving behind every royal insignia, he draped the hood of the cloak over his head, concealing his face in shadow. The palace guards were trained to prevent intruders from entering, not to stop Pharaoh himself from leaving. He knew the servants' passageways, the changing of the watch, the blind spots in the palace security. Within minutes, Egypt's living god had slipped into the night like a common thief, intoxicated by the simple thrill of forbidden freedom. The night market of Memphis was a riot of color, sound, and scent even at this late hour. Lamplight spilled from open-air stalls where merchants hawked everything from spiced wine to copper amulets. Laborers who worked through the heat of the day now enjoyed the relative cool of evening, sharing drinks and stories. Musicians played on street corners, children darted between adult legs despite the late hour, and the air hung heavy with the mingled aromas of grilled fish, baking bread, and exotic incense. Kyle moved through the crowd in a state of wonder, anonymous and unremarkable in his plain attire. No one bowed or averted their eyes. No one modulated their language or behavior in his presence. He was simply another face in the crowd, and the sensation was dizzying in its novelty. "Fresh dates, sweetest in Memphis," called a vendor. Kyle stopped, suddenly realizing he had brought no money. As pharaoh, the concept of purchase was foreign to him. Everything in Egypt technically belonged to him already. "Just looking," he mumbled, moving on quickly. He wandered deeper into the market's maze, drinking in the sights and sounds of his kingdom experienced as a commoner. Couples walked hand in hand without concern for propriety. Old men argued politics openly, criticizing policies that Kyle himself had implemented. A group of young women laughed uproariously at some shared joke, their faces free of the careful masks worn by court ladies. So absorbed was he in these observations that he failed to notice the group of rough-looking men until he'd walked directly into their midst. They stood in a loose circle around a small wooden stand where a woman sat, her back to Kale. "Tell my fortune again, Gypsy," slurred one man, clearly deep in his cups. "I don't like the first one you gave me." "The cards speak truth, not preference," replied the woman, her voice low and melodious. "If you seek flattery rather than insight, perhaps the wine seller would be a better recipient of your coin." Kyle froze, recognition shooting through him like lightning. That voice. The drunk man leaned threateningly over the small table. "Listen here. The lady has answered you," Kyle interrupted, stepping forward before he could think better of it. "Perhaps it's time to seek your entertainment elsewhere." The group turned toward him, sizing up this unexpected interloper. Kale straightened to his full height, instinctively adopting the commanding posture that had intimidated generals and foreign ambassadors alike. Drunk as they were, the men seemed to sense something dangerous in his bearing. "Come on," muttered one, tugging at his belligerent friend's arm. "There's better fun at the river docks." They shuffled away, throwing dark glances over their shoulders, but apparently deciding the confrontation wasn't worth pursuing. Only when they disappeared into the crowd did Kyle allow himself to look directly at the fortune teller. Naya sat behind a small wooden table draped with a colorful cloth. Before her lay a spread of painted cards and the same carved stones she'd cast in his throne room days earlier. Her copper bangles caught the lamplight as she gathered the cards with practiced hands. When she finally looked up, her amber eyes widened in recognition despite his disguise. "Well," she said after a moment, her voice betraying only the slightest tremor. "The cards told me I would have an unusual visitor tonight, but even they can be cryptic about details." Kyle glanced around nervously, but no one was paying them any attention. "You recognize me. I would know you blindfolded, Pharaoh Kale," she replied softly. "One does not forget the face of a living god, nor the man who holds one's fate in his hands." He winced at that. "I didn't order any action against you for your prophecy." "No," she agreed, studying him with those unsettling amber eyes. "Yet here you stand in the night market, disguised as a commoner. Have my words troubled your sleep, great Pharaoh?" Instead of answering, Kyle gestured to the empty stool across from her. "May I?" Naya's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she nodded. "By all means. Though I should warn you, people might talk if they see me entertaining two men in one night." A hint of mischief curved her lips. "Even if one of them is Pharaoh himself." Kyle sat, uncomfortably aware of how strange this situation was. Here he sat, ruler of the mightiest civilization on Earth, perched on a wobbly wooden stool, across from a woman who by all rights should be terrified in his presence. Yet Naya showed no fear, only that same directness that had first caught his attention in the throne room. "Why did you come to the palace?" he asked abruptly. "That day." "With your warning." Naya considered him for a long moment before answering. "The same reason you've come to the market tonight, I imagine, because something compelled me to step outside the boundaries that define my life." She began absently shuffling her painted cards. "We call it the calling among my people. When the signs align and the spirits speak, we must listen or suffer the consequences of ignoring divine guidance." "And the signs told you to warn me against my marriage to Lady Alara? A woman you've never met? From a family you don't know?" "I never mentioned Lady Alara," Naya pointed out. "I spoke only of a choice, your choice. That you immediately thought of her suggests your own doubts were already taking root." Her hand stilled on the cards. "Tell me, did you make your announcement tonight? Is Egypt's future now sealed?" Kyle shook his head, surprised at how easily he shared this information with her. "I, delayed, extended the festival, I don't know why. Don't you?" Her gaze was penetrating. A couple walked past their table, the woman leaning into her companion's shoulder as they laughed together. Kyle watched them go, suddenly acutely aware of all he had never experienced. The simple joy of walking freely, of loving freely. "What is it like?" he asked suddenly. "To live as you do, following these signs and spirits rather than the dictates of counsel and tradition?" Naya's expression softened. "It has its own burdens. My people are not welcomed in most places. We live on the margins, always moving, always watched with suspicion." She absently twisted one of her copper bangles. "But there is freedom, too, to follow the wind, to dance under the stars without worrying who might see, to love." She trailed off, then seemed to catch herself. "But such things would mean little to Pharaoh." "You're wrong," Kale said quietly. "They mean everything." Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that transcended their vastly different stations. For a heartbeat, he wasn't Pharaoh, and she wasn't a fortune-teller. They were simply a man and a woman seeing each other with unexpected clarity. Naya broke the spell first, glancing around at the thinning market crowd. "It grows late. You should return to your palace before your absence is discovered." "Read my fortune first," he said impulsively. "Not as Pharaoh, as just a man." She hesitated, then nodded. "Give me your hands." Kyle extended his hands across the small table. Naya took them in hers, and he was struck by their warmth, the slight calluses that spoke of a life lived through work rather than ceremony. Her fingers traced the lines of his palms with gentle precision. "You have lived as two people," she murmured, "the God your people worship and the man who bears that burden. But there is a third self, waiting to be born, one who bridges both worlds without being consumed by either." Her touch sent an unfamiliar warmth spreading up his arms. She was close enough now that he could smell jasmine in her hair, see the faint freckles across her nose, count the individual lashes that framed those remarkable amber eyes. "Your heartline shows great passion kept tightly controlled," she continued, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. "You have never allowed yourself to want something purely for yourself, have you?" "It is not Pharaoh's place to want," he replied, the words automatic, rehearsed. "Only to serve Ma'at, divine order and balance. And what of the man beneath the crown?" Her eyes lifted to his. "What does he want?" The question hung between them, dangerous and thrilling. Kyle felt something shift inside him, as if a door long sealed had cracked open, allowing in a breath of air from some unknown landscape. Before he could answer, shouts erupted from the far end of the market. People began moving quickly, looking over their shoulders with alarm. "Royal Guards!" someone called out in warning. "Searching the market!" Naya's hands tightened on his. "They're looking for you." Kyle stood quickly, pulling his hood lower. "I need to go." "Not that way," Naya said, rising and gathering her belongings with practiced speed. "They'll be covering all the main paths back to the palace. Come with me." Without waiting for his response, she took his hand and pulled him into the shadows between market stalls. Kyle followed, his heart racing with a mixture of alarm and exhilaration as they ducked through narrow alleys and behind buildings. Naya moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with hidden paths and secret ways, leading him deeper into the labyrinthine heart of Memphis. "Where are we going?" he whispered, as they paused in the shadow of a dyer's workshop, waiting as a patrol of guards passed by on the adjoining street. "Somewhere you won't be found until it's safe to return," she replied, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Do you trust me, Pharaoh Kale?" The question was preposterous. She was a commoner, a nomad, possibly even a charlatan using mysticism to manipulate the superstitious. By all logic, he should command her to lead him directly back to the palace, where he would face whatever political fallout his impulsive adventure had caused. Yet as he looked at her, this fierce free woman who spoke to him as an equal and offered help without subservience, Kyle realized that he did trust her, perhaps more than the counselors who had surrounded him all his life. "Yes," he said simply, "I trust you." Her smile then was like the first ray of sun after the annual flooding, bright with promise and new possibilities. She squeezed his hand once, then tugged him forward again, away from the world he had always known, and towards something altogether unknown. And for the first time in his life, Pharaoh Kale embraced the uncertainty with eager heart, feeling more alive in this moment of danger than in all his years upon the golden throne of Egypt. Dawn was nothing more than a faint promise on the eastern horizon when Naya finally brought them to a halt. They had traversed what felt like the entirety of Memphis, through narrow alleyways between artisans' workshops, across silent courtyards, and along the banks of irrigation channels that fed the city's gardens. Now they stood before what appeared to be an abandoned storehouse near the city's southern edge, its mud brick walls weathered by years of neglect. "We'll be safe here," Naya said, pushing aside a wooden panel that served as a door, "at least until we can determine whether it's safe for you to return to the palace." Kyle ducked to enter the low doorway, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dimness within. The space was small but surprisingly clean, with colorful woven rugs covering the packed earth floor and fabric hangings softening the rough walls. A few cushions were arranged around a low table, and oil lamps hung from the ceiling beams, currently unlit in the pre-dawn darkness. "Your home?" he asked, taking in the modest but comfortable surroundings. Naya shook her head as she moved about lighting the lamps. "A place my people use when passing through Memphis. We maintain similar shelters in most major cities, hidden spots where we can rest without drawing attention." As the warm glow of lamplight filled the room, Kyle noticed details he'd missed in the shadows, small personal touches that suggested recent habitation. A half-finished basket sat in one corner, reeds spilling from its open weave. A collection of dried herbs hung from one beam, filling the air with subtle, earthy fragrances. A wooden flute rested atop a folded blanket. "You've been staying here," he observed. "Since my visit to your palace, yes." Naya knelt to kindle a small fire in a clay brazier at the center of the room. "I thought it wise to remain accessible, should my prophecy require further explanation." Kyle settled onto one of the cushions, suddenly aware of the night's exertions in his tired muscles. Without the immediate urgency of their escape, the reality of his situation began to sink in. He, Pharaoh of Egypt, was hiding in a nomad's shelter, having abandoned his palace without warning. By now, the entire court would be in an uproar. "I've been reckless," he murmured, passing a hand over his face. "The council will be frantic." "They will survive the shock," Naya replied, her tone light as she set a small copper pot of water over the brazier. "Perhaps it's good for them to be reminded that even Pharaoh is a man beneath his crown, a man who has responsibilities," Kyle countered, though without conviction. "Duties he cannot simply abandon on a whim." Naya turned to look at him, firelight dancing across her features. "Was it truly a whim that brought you to the market tonight, or something deeper?" The question hung between them, pressing for an honesty Kyle wasn't sure he was ready to confront. Before he could form a response, she turned away again, attending to the brewing tea. "You should rest," she said, nodding toward a curtained alcove. "There's a sleeping pallet beyond that hanging. I'll wake you when the city is fully stirring, and we can better judge how to return you safely." Exhaustion tugged at him, but Kyle shook his head. "Not yet. He hesitated, then continued with a frankness that surprised even himself. "I'm not ready to go back, not yet." Naya studied him with those remarkable amber eyes, seeming to see past his words to the turmoil beneath. After a moment she nodded and poured the steaming tea into 2 simple clay cups. "Then we shall sit and talk a while longer," she said, offering him one of the cups. "After all, it's not every day I entertain Pharaoh in my humble dwelling." Her teasing tone eased some of the tension that had gathered around his heart. He accepted the cup, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. The tea was unlike any he'd tasted in the palace, sharp and herbal, with hints of mint and some other flavor he couldn't identify. "This is good," he said with surprise. "Desert sage and wild honey," she explained, settling across from him. "It clears the mind and strengthens the spirit. We call it traveler's tea, good for those journeying through unfamiliar lands." "Is that what I'm doing? Journeying through unfamiliar lands? Aren't you?" Her eyebrow arched expressively. The mighty Pharaoh sneaking through his own city in disguise, hiding from his guards, taking tea with a gypsy fortune teller. "I'd say you've wandered quite far from familiar territory." Kyle couldn't help but laugh. A genuine sound of amusement that felt foreign to his own ears. When had he last laughed like this? Not the polite chuckle of court pleasantries, but real, unguarded mirth. "Perhaps you're right," he admitted, taking another sip of the bracing tea. "Though I'm still not certain why I felt compelled to leave the palace tonight, of all nights. Aren't you?" Naya set down her cup and reached for the small leather pouch that never seemed to leave her side. "The cards might offer clarity if you wish to see." Kyle hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Show me." With practiced hands, Naya withdrew a deck of painted cards from the pouch and began to shuffle them. Unlike the formal readings conducted by temple priests, elaborate affairs involving lengthy invocations and ritualized movements, her actions were fluid and natural, as if the cards were simply an extension of her own hands. "These have been passed down through my mother's line for 7 generations, she explained as she shuffled. "Each card hand-painted by women of our family. They speak most clearly to those with our blood, but sometimes," she glanced up at him, "sometimes they choose to speak to others." "Like me?" Kale asked skeptically, despite the strange certainty growing within him. "Like you." She set the deck on the low table between them. "Cut the cards with your left hand, the one closest to your heart." He did as instructed, feeling slightly foolish yet simultaneously drawn into the ritual's quiet intensity. Naya took the cards and began laying them out in a pattern that resembled a 5-pointed star. "5 aspects of your journey," she explained as she placed each card face down. "Past, present, challenge, guidance, future." When all 5 positions were filled, she looked up at him. "Are you ready to see?" Kyle nodded, somehow unable to form words past the unexpected tightness in his throat. Naya turned over the first card. It depicted a magnificent throne atop a pyramid, with a solitary figure seated upon it, separated from the masses below. "The lonely crown," she murmured. "Your past. Power achieved at the cost of true connection. Leadership that isolates even as it elevates." She turned the second card. This one showed 2 paths diverging from a single point, with a figure standing at the crossroads looking in both directions. The crossroads. Your present moment. A time of choice between continuing the path of tradition or venturing into unknown territory. The third card revealed a woman in noble attire, standing beside an empty throne, her face a mask of perfect serenity that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The false queen," Naya said softly. "Your challenge. Appearances that deceive, arrangements that satisfy duty but starve the soul." Kale shifted uncomfortably. The parallels to his situation with Lady Alara were too precise to dismiss as mere coincidence. The fourth card showed a night sky filled with stars, with one particularly bright star illuminating a winding path through darkness. The guiding star. Direction will come from trusting the light within rather than the expectations without. Follow what resonates as truth in your heart, even when others cannot see it. Naya's hand hovered over the final card, the future, for a long moment before turning it over. Her sharp intake of breath made Kale lean forward to see. The card depicted 2 figures standing beneath an archway, formed by intertwining branches. Their hands were joined, their faces lifted toward a sun that seemed to be both rising and setting simultaneously. At their feet, a crown lay discarded. "The sacred union," Naya whispered, her voice strangely altered. "I've never drawn this card for anyone outside our people." "What does it mean?" Kyle asked, oddly affected by her reaction. She met his eyes, something vulnerable flickering across her face before she composed herself. "It represents a joining that transcends ordinary bonds, a partnership of equals that transforms not only the individuals involved, but the very world around them. And the discarded crown, some treasures must be surrendered to gain greater ones," she said simply. Silence fell between them as Kyle studied the final card, its implications igniting both alarm and an inexplicable sense of rightness in his chest. Could the gods truly be directing him toward a path so radical, so contrary to everything he had been raised to believe? "The cards don't dictate your future," Naya said, as if reading his thoughts. "They illuminate possibilities, paths that may unfold if certain choices are made. The deciding remains with you. Do you believe that?" Kyle asked, looking up from the cards to her face. "Truly? Or do you believe some fates are fixed, beyond our power to change?" Naya considered his question with the seriousness it deserved. "My people have a saying. The stars suggest, but the heart decides. Even the strongest destiny can be refused, though rarely without consequence." She gathered the cards with reverent hands, returning them to their pouch. "When I came to your palace, I spoke of Egypt's ruin if you married where duty dictates. What I didn't tell you, couldn't tell you before those who would not understand, was the rest of what I saw." "Tell me now," Kyle urged. "I need to know everything if I'm to make sense of these feelings." Naya drew a deep breath, her gaze turning inward as if seeing again whatever vision had prompted her original warning. "I saw two possible Egypts," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of formal prophecy. "In one, magnificent temples crumbled, the Nile ran shallow, and foreign conquerors planted their flags in our soil. Your line ended within 3 generations, your name eventually scratched from monuments by those who followed." Kyle felt cold despite the room's growing warmth as morning approached. "And the other? A golden age," she said simply. "Innovation, prosperity, justice flowing like the Nile at highest flood. Your descendants ruling not through fear or divine right alone, but through wisdom that brought neighboring kingdoms willingly into alliance. Egypt becoming the center of a world where knowledge was prized above conquest, where the gods smiled on a people who had found balance between tradition and growth. And this second Egypt, it comes about if I reject the arranged marriage?" Kyle asked, struggling to reconcile such a vast divergence of fates, hinging on what seemed, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively minor decision. "Not just that," Naya said, meeting his gaze directly. "It comes about if you choose to follow your heart rather than convention. If you recognize that sometimes the greatest service to one's people is to transform what no longer serves them, even when that transformation appears radical to those invested in maintaining the old ways." The implications of her words hung between them, too momentous to be directly acknowledged, yet too significant to be ignored. Something was happening here, in this humble shelter on the outskirts of Memphis, something that felt both terrifying and inevitable, like standing at the edge of the Nile's greatest cataract, knowing that to step forward meant irrevocable change. "How can I be certain," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "that what I'm feeling, what these cards and visions suggest is truly the will of the gods, and not merely my own desire for escape from duty's constraints?" Naya reached across the small table between them, her hand coming to rest lightly upon his. The contact sent warmth spiraling up his arm, a sensation both foreign and strangely familiar, as if his body recognized something his mind was still struggling to comprehend. "The gods rarely speak in certainties," she said gently. "They offer signs, coincidences, feelings that persist despite all rational argument. They placed that restlessness in your heart that drove you from your palace tonight. They guided your steps to the very market stall where I sat. They brought us here, to this moment of quiet truth between a pharaoh and a fortune teller." Her fingers tightened briefly on his. "The question isn't whether you can be certain. The question is whether you're brave enough to follow this path without certainty, trusting that what feels right in the deepest part of your soul is worth the risk of leaving the known behind." As if in answer to her words, the first genuine ray of dawn light slipped through the small window, high in the eastern wall, falling directly across their joined hands. They both stared at this simple phenomenon, this alignment of architecture and astronomy that seemed in this charged moment like the most explicit sign the gods could possibly offer. "Dawn breaks," Naya said softly, withdrawing her hand with what seemed like reluctance. "Soon the city will be fully awake. We should plan your return to the palace." Kyle nodded, feeling the weight of his position settle back upon his shoulders. Yet something fundamental had shifted during the night. The burden felt different now. Not lighter exactly, but changed in quality, as if he carried it now by choice rather than inheritance alone. "Yes," he agreed, rising to his feet. "I must return. There are matters I need to address, decisions that can no longer be delayed." As he moved toward the door, preparing to face whatever chaos his absence had created, he paused and turned back to where Naya still knelt beside the small fire. "Will I see you again?" he asked, the question emerging before he could consider its implications. She looked up at him, her expression a complex mixture of emotions he couldn't fully decipher. "That depends, Pharaoh Kale, on what decisions you make when you return to your golden throne. And if I wish to continue our conversation, to explore further what the cards have shown." A small smile curved her lips, transforming her face with a warmth that caught at something deep in his chest. "Then you need only look for me where the wind blows and the stars speak clearly. I will be there." It wasn't a practical answer, yet somehow Kale understood it perfectly. With a nod that contained more meaning than words could express, he slipped through the doorway and into the brightening day, leaving behind the humble shelter, but carrying with him something precious and new, the first tentative awareness of what it might mean to choose his own destiny. The royal palace was in chaos when Kale returned. Guards stood at attention with visible relief as he strode through the main gates, still wearing common clothes from his night in the city. The council had assembled, their faces a mixture of outrage, concern, and curiosity. "Great Pharaoh," Vizier Amenhotep rushed forward. "We feared the worst." "I was never in danger," Kyle replied, his voice carrying the authority bred into him since birth. High Priest Ramesses stepped forward, his features tight with anger. "No one questions your divine right to do as you wish, Great Pharaoh, but with the Amunet delegation present, have they been properly attended in my absence?" Kyle interrupted, moving toward his throne. "Yes, but excellent. Then no harm has been done." He settled onto the golden throne. "Now I wish to bathe and change before meeting with our visitors." Only Ramesses lingered after the others departed. "Something has changed in you," the high priest observed quietly. Kale met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps something needed to." "Be careful," Ramesses warned, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are whispers of a fortune teller whose prophecies challenge the divine order, of magic that can cloud even a pharaoh's mind. She is under my protection," Kyle said with fierce certainty. "If any harm comes to her, I will hold you personally responsible." For 3 days, Kale played his role as pharaoh with flawless precision, but beneath this perfect performance, his mind constantly returned to the humble shelter, to amber eyes that saw the man beneath the crown, to cards that spoke of diverging destinies. On the 4th evening, as musicians played softly in the palace gardens, Kyle found himself at Lady Alara's side. "You seem distant tonight," she observed quietly as they strolled past a reflecting pool. "Forgive me," he replied. "The festival has been demanding." "Since your absence, you've changed. Something troubles you deeply." He stopped walking. "May I speak frankly, Lady Alara? Are you happy with this arrangement? Truly?" Her eyes widened at his directness. "I am honored by the match, of course, but if you're asking whether my heart rejoices at the prospect, I cannot claim that it does." "Why did you never say so?" "For the same reason you didn't, I imagine. Because duty rarely consults with desire." "There is someone else," Alara said suddenly, her voice barely audible. "At home in Amunet, a royal scribe. We grew up together, but his station..." She trailed off. "I too have met someone who challenges everything I thought I knew," Kyle admitted. Before they could speak further, a commotion drew their attention. Guards were preventing someone from entering. Naya. Kyle moved through the garden, his pulse racing. "I know this person," he told the guards. "She is a seer who has provided insights to the throne before. Release her." In a private pavilion, Naya's amber eyes met his directly. "High Priest Ramesses plans to declare you unfit to rule if you delay the betrothal announcement. He has been meeting secretly with military commanders." "So you came to warn me," he said, warmth unfurling at the thought of her risking her safety for his. "I had to," she replied simply. "I haven't stopped thinking about you," he confessed, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur. "Nor I you," she admitted, though I told myself it was madness, that nothing could ever come of these feelings. Is it madness? Or is it exactly what the cards foretold? The sacred union that transforms not just ourselves but the world around us. You're not alone, she whispered as he touched her cheek. But Kale, it's impossible. You are Pharaoh. I am a nomad, an outsider. Perhaps it's time those borders were redrawn, he murmured. Perhaps it's time for Egypt to embrace a new vision. High Priest Ramesses approached, interrupting their moment. The Amunet delegation grows concerned by your absence, he said, his contempt for Naya unmistakable. The extended festival concludes tomorrow. The people expect an announcement. After he left, Naya's hand found Kale's in the shadows. Whatever you decide, know that my heart is yours, she whispered. Even if duty demands we walk separate paths. Meet me tomorrow, he said impulsively, at the small temple of Isis near the eastern gate, at midday. As she slipped away, Kyle remained in the pavilion, contemplating the choice before him, one affecting not just his future but potentially Egypt's itself. Yet one certainty had crystallized. Some treasures were worth any price, even a golden crown. The only question was whether he possessed the courage to reach for it, knowing the earthquake of change that would inevitably follow. The Temple of Isis, near the eastern gate, was modest compared to Memphis's grand monuments. Kale arrived shortly before midday, having slipped away from the palace in the guise of making a private devotional offering. He wore simple robes beneath a hooded cloak, with 2 trusted guards remaining outside at his insistence. Inside, the temple was cool and dim. A solitary priestess tended the altar before respectfully withdrawing, leaving him seemingly alone until his eyes adjusted to see Naya kneeling before a statue of Isis, cradling the infant Horus. You came, he said softly, his heart leaping at her familiar silhouette. She rose to face him, her simple linen exchanged for garments of deeper quality, her dark hair adorned with jasmine blossoms. I wasn't certain you would, she replied, not with today's announcement looming. I had to see you, he said simply. I spoke with Lady Alara. She harbors no more desire for this match than I do. She loves another, someone deemed unsuitable by her family's ambitions. And yet the announcement will proceed, Naya observed with quiet sadness. That's what I've come to discuss. Kyle lowered his voice. I've been thinking about your prophecy, about the 2 possible futures for Egypt. If I truly stand at such a crossroads, shouldn't I choose the path that leads to flourishing rather than ruin? Hope flickered in Naya's amber eyes. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that perhaps the gods have brought us together for a purpose greater than either of us imagined. That perhaps the sacred union the cards foretold isn't merely symbolic. But you are Pharaoh, she reminded him gently. Your deepest self belongs to Egypt. What if there's another way to serve them? He pressed, taking her hands in his. What if the prosperity you saw comes precisely because Pharaoh chooses to follow his heart? Such a choice would have consequences beyond anything we can imagine. I know, but for the first time in my life I feel fully awake, fully alive. He tilted her face up. Tell me honestly, do you feel it too? This connection between us? If there is bewitchment here, then I am equally ensorcelled, she admitted, her fingers tightening around his. From the moment I cast the stones and saw your fate entwined with Egypt's future, I've been unable to turn away. Then let's follow it together, he whispered, drawing her closer, whatever storms it brings. Their kiss was both inevitable and revolutionary, a simple human gesture that contained the power to reshape an empire. When they separated, Kyle pressed his forehead against Naya's. I cannot go through with the betrothal, he said, the words both terrifying and liberating. The council will resist, she warned. Ramesses especially. Let them. I am still Pharaoh. My word is still law. Footsteps approached from the temple entrance. The priestess returned to inform them that soldiers had come, saying High Priest Ramesses required Pharaoh's immediate presence. You should go, Naya urged. Defiance will serve neither of us if it comes too early. Where will you go? Back to our shelter by the southern gate. My people have ways of passing unseen when necessary. Until I send for you, Kale completed firmly. Tonight, after the feast, whatever announcement I make today, know that my heart is decided. The festival's culminating banquet transformed the Great Hall into a vision of Egypt's power and prosperity. At the high table, Kyle sat with the double crown heavy on his brow, Lady Alara resplendent beside him, and High Priest Ramesses maintaining a veneer of satisfaction. As the feast reached its height, Vizier Amenhotep announced the time had come for Pharaoh's pronouncement. Kale rose and a hush fell over the hall. "Noble lords and ladies," he began, "for 30 years I have served as Pharaoh, guided by tradition. But true leadership requires recognizing when tradition itself must evolve. The alliance between Egypt and Amunet is valuable, but it need not be sealed through a marriage in which neither party's heart truly resides." Gasps erupted throughout the hall. Lady Alara went still beside him. "Lady Alara deserves a union born of love, not merely political expedience," Kale continued, "as does Egypt's pharaoh. Therefore, I will not be announcing a betrothal this evening." The murmurs grew louder. Ramesses rose slowly, his face darkening with fury. "Instead," Kyle pressed on, "I announce a new kind of alliance, one based on mutual respect, without requiring the sacrifice of personal happiness." Lady Alara's father surged to his feet. "This is an outrage, an insult to Amunet." "No insult is intended," Kyle replied calmly. "Indeed, I believe Lady Alara herself might prefer the freedom to follow her heart." He turned to her with a questioning glance. To everyone's astonishment, a small, grateful smile curved Alara's lips as she nodded slightly. Ramesses stepped forward, striking his staff against the floor. "Great Pharaoh seems to have forgotten himself. These strange pronouncements can only be explained by foreign influence, perhaps even malevolent enchantment." "I speak with my own mind and heart," Kyle countered, "and with the authority vested in me as Pharaoh." "Perhaps," Ramesses conceded with dangerous smoothness, "but there are whispers of a gypsy fortune-teller whose prophecies have beguiled even the divine ruler." The hall went deathly quiet. "Choose your next words with exceptional care," Kyle warned. Ramesses smiled coldly. "While you communed privately with the foreign mystic, I dispatched soldiers to apprehend her and her people. The gypsies will be expelled from Egyptian territory by nightfall." "You did what?" Ice flooded Kale's veins. "A prudent precaution, one that the council unanimously approved in your absence." In that moment, Pharaoh Kale made the most consequential decision of his reign. "General Jabari," he commanded, "countermand those orders immediately. No action is to be taken against any gypsy encampments without my direct approval." "Too late," Ramesses interjected. "The orders have already been executed. Even now, the gypsies are being escorted to the border." "You have overstepped your authority for the last time," Kyle said. "Guards, escort High Priest Ramesses to the temple compound. He is relieved of his duties pending investigation." After a tense moment, the guards moved to flank Ramesses. "You choose a foreign witch over Egypt's sacred traditions?" Ramesses demanded, shocked. "I choose a future where tradition serves the people, not constrains them," Kyle replied. As Ramesses was led away, Kyle turned to General Jabari. "Prepare my chariot. We ride immediately to intercept the gypsy caravan." With a final glance around the stunned Great Hall, Pharaoh Kale strode toward the doors. For the first time in his reign, perhaps in generations, Pharaoh had publicly chosen personal truth over political expedience, the wisdom of the heart over tradition. As Kale mounted his chariot and signaled the driver to make haste toward the southern gate, one certainty burned within him. Some treasures were worth any price, even the weight of Egypt's double crown. Dawn was just breaking when Pharaoh Kale's chariot finally caught sight of the gypsy caravan. After riding through the night with 40 royal guards, relief flooded through him at seeing the nomads still within Egyptian territory, a line of brightly painted wagons surrounded by mounted soldiers. "Sound the royal horn," he commanded. The deep blast halted the caravan. As they approached, Kyle spotted Naya near the lead wagon, standing straight-backed and defiant despite the soldiers flanking her. "Halt in the name of Pharaoh," called his herald. The soldiers immediately knelt, confused by his unexpected arrival. Kyle stepped from his chariot, setting aside his ceremonial symbols of authority. "Rise," he commanded. "Who leads this operation?" Captain Menkare stepped forward. "Acting on direct orders from High Priest Ramesses and the Royal Council." "Orders which I did not issue," Kyle replied firmly. "Orders which are hereby countermanded." The captain paled. "Forgiveness, great Pharaoh. We were told the directive came with royal approval. You were misled." Kyle turned to the gathered gypsies. "You have all been subject to an injustice. For this, I offer my deepest apologies. The expulsion order is rescinded. You are free to return to your encampments with the full protection of Pharaoh's law." Relief swept through the nomads, but Naya remained still, her expression guarded in a way that chilled Kale's heart. As the soldiers prepared for the return journey, Kyle moved toward her. "You came," she said simply. "Did you doubt I would?" he asked. An elderly man with a white beard approached, leaning on a walking stick. Grandfather, Naya acknowledged with respect. So this is him, the elder said, studying Kyle. The pharaoh who defies his priests for a fortune-teller's prophecy. For the sake of truth, Kyle corrected, and justice. Pretty words. But you have made powerful enemies today, the old man warned. A royal messenger arrived breathlessly. Great Pharaoh, urgent news from Memphis. High Priest Ramesses has escaped custody. He has gathered supporters and declared that Pharaoh's mind has been clouded by foreign magic. He calls for a purification ritual. There is unrest. Kale turned to Naya, understanding now the shadow in her eyes. You knew this would happen. I knew there would be resistance, she acknowledged softly. When the cards showed the discarded crown, they warned the path would not be easy. I must return to Memphis, Kyle decided. Come with me. Stand beside me as I confront Ramesses. Pain flickered across Naya's features. I cannot. Your people are not ready. Memphis stands on the brink of civil unrest because Pharaoh has challenged tradition for the sake of, in their eyes, a foreign witch. I don't care what they think, Kale insisted. But you must care, Naya replied, touching his face gently. You are Pharaoh. Your first duty must be to Egypt's stability. My presence would only inflame the situation. So you would leave? He asked, hurt evident in his voice. After all that has happened between us? Not exile, she corrected. Strategic retreat. My people have survived by knowing when to stand firm and when to bend with the wind. How long? He asked, barely above a whisper. Until the storm passes. Until Egypt is ready for the change the cards foretold. We'll follow the Eastern Star, she added meaningfully. Remember the fourth card? The guiding star? Kyle understood she was giving him a way to find her when the time was right. This is not the end, he said, taking her hands. Whatever challenges Ramesses may raise, my heart remains decided. I will find a way forward. When the time is right, look to the eastern horizon, she replied, squeezing his hands. I will be waiting. As Kale mounted his chariot, her whispered words followed him. Until the Eastern Star guides you, remember that some treasures are worth waiting for, even when the waiting seems unbearable. With a final glance at the Gypsy caravan, Pharaoh Kale signaled for the return journey to Memphis, carrying the certainty that this parting was not an ending, but a necessary pause in a story just beginning to unfold. Memphis was a city divided when Pharaoh Kale returned. Some citizens cheered his procession, while others watched in wary silence, clutching temple amulets. Rumors of magic, betrayal, and divine displeasure had spread like wildfire. Outside the temple of Amun-Ra, a substantial crowd had gathered. Kyle halted his chariot within sight but beyond reach of the throng. How many support Ramesses? He asked General Jabari. Perhaps 300 citizens. The high priest has barricaded himself inside with loyal temple guards. And the rest of the city? Uncertain, watching, waiting. Jabari hesitated. Your pursuit of the Gypsy caravan has complicated matters. Some whisper it confirms Ramesses' claims of enchantment. Kyle nodded grimly. Naya had been right. Her presence would have only exacerbated the situation. I wish to address the people, he decided. Not from the palace or temple steps, but somewhere more accessible. The central marketplace would allow the greatest number to hear you directly. Have heralds announce my presence there in 1 hour, and send word to Ramesses that I offer him safe passage to present his concerns publicly. The marketplace had never hosted such an event in memory. Traditionally, Pharaoh addressed subjects from elevated platforms that reinforced the distance between divine ruler and mortal populace. Yet here was Pharaoh Kale, descending directly onto the stone-paved square where common citizens conducted daily business. He wore full ceremonial regalia, but something in his bearing differed from the typical remote dignity. He moved among his people with a presence both regal and approachable. At the far end of the marketplace, High Priest Ramesses arrived in his leopard skin and white linen robes, followed by priests bearing sacred standards and temple guards with ceremonial spears. People of Memphis, Kale began, today we stand at a crossroads between two possible futures for our kingdom. High Priest Ramesses believes I have been corrupted by foreign influence. He acted without royal authority to expel people he deemed undesirable, and when challenged, he retreated to temple sanctuary to foment resistance. Ramesses stepped forward. I acted to protect Egypt from corruption. When Pharaoh falls under malign influence, it is the high priest's duty to intervene. What malign influence do you claim affects me? Kale challenged. Compassion for those different from ourselves? questioning whether every tradition serves its original purpose. "The Gypsy witch," someone called from the crowd. "Yes, I consulted a seer not of Egyptian birth," Kale acknowledged. She spoke of two possible paths for Egypt's future, one leading to decline, one to unprecedented flourishing. What Ramesses fears is not foreign magic, but domestic change, not corruption of tradition, but evolution of tradition to better serve Egypt's future. "Blasphemy," Ramesses thundered. "Our traditions were established by the gods themselves. Egypt has always grown stronger by selective adaptation, incorporating new concepts while maintaining our essential identity. This is not weakness, but wisdom." Sensing the shifting mood, Ramesses attacked more personally. "And your rejection of the Amunet alliance? Was that for Egypt's benefit, or to clear the path for a Gypsy bride?" A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Kyle felt the weight of the moment. His next words would set Egypt's course for generations. He remembered Naya's wisdom about timing, yet also recalled the vision of Egypt's golden age that required courage to achieve. "The alliance with Amunet continues," Kyle announced firmly. "Not through a marriage that serves political convenience at the expense of personal truth, but through mutual respect and cooperation. As for the seer, she and her people have voluntarily withdrawn beyond our borders, not because they deserve exile, but because they understand the delicate balance between challenging tradition and respecting its necessary role." Surprise registered on Ramesses' face, his most potent weapon suddenly neutralized. "People of Memphis, hear now Pharaoh's decree. For 30 days the Royal Council will convene in open session, hearing from representatives of all Egypt's people. Together we will examine which traditions serve Egypt's flourishing and which have become constraints." Astonishment rippled through the crowd at this revolutionary concept of open governance. "The temples will have honored representation," Kyle added, extending a hand to Ramesses. "Their wisdom regarding divine will remains essential to Egypt's well-being." It was a masterful compromise, allowing Ramesses to save face while neutralizing his opposition. The high priest reluctantly agreed to participate. "Let it be recorded," Kyle proclaimed, "that today Egypt chose wisdom over fear, growth over stagnation, unity over division." A cheer erupted from the crowd, recognizing they had witnessed the beginning of something new in Egypt's long history. As Kale returned to his chariot, he felt both triumph and sadness. He had secured his throne and set Egypt on a path toward the golden age Naya had foretold, but at the price of separation from the woman who had awakened him to these possibilities. The eastern horizon beckoned in his mind, a horizon he could not yet pursue, while Egypt's renewal remained so freshly begun. But someday, when these new seeds had flourished into stability, he would look to that horizon again. 3 seasons passed as Egypt embraced Kale's governance reforms. The Chamber of Voices became permanent, giving all classes of society representation. Trade flourished, and even High Priest Ramesses found himself increasingly isolated as other temple hierarchs recognized the advantages of the new system. Yet for all his public success, Kyle's thoughts often drifted eastward. "The kingdom is stable," observed Vizier Amenhotep, noting the maps of eastern trade routes on Kyle's desk. Almost as if Egypt could function smoothly, even if Pharaoh were temporarily absent. With the vizier's blessing, Kale journeyed to the eastern borderlands disguised as a merchant. At a crossroads market, a woman with copper bangles gave him a familiar divination stone, marked with a crescent moon. "Follow the path of the rising star. Those who are expected find their way." That night, Kyle discovered Naya's nomadic camp, nestled in a hidden valley. She welcomed him without surprise. The cards do not lie, but timing is everything. Instead of returning immediately to Egypt as his queen, Naya proposed an alternative, a traditional nomadic ceremony that would join them in spirit while allowing her to bridge both worlds gradually. A sacred union that acknowledges we belong to each other, even as we each also belong to larger purposes. Under starlight, they received matching spiral marks on their wrists, symbols of a bond that would transcend their necessary separations until Egypt was truly ready to accept a nomad queen. "A union based on choice rather than convention," Kyle murmured as they watched the dawn break. "On shared vision rather than political advantage." The grand plaza before the Temple of Amun-Ra overflowed with citizens who had traveled from every corner of Egypt to witness an unprecedented event, the formal presentation of Pharaoh's chosen consort, a woman whose origins defied all traditional expectations. Pharaoh Kale emerged from the temple in full ceremonial regalia, But it was the woman at his side who drew every eye. Nile walked beside Pharaoh, not behind him as tradition dictated. Her gown combined Egyptian formal attire with subtle touches from her nomadic heritage. Fine white linen, embroidered with unfamiliar patterns, the traditional royal pectoral modified to incorporate spiral designs. Her copper bangles still encircled her forearms, chiming softly with each step. "People of Egypt," Kale addressed the crowd, "for 31 years I have served as your pharaoh, guided first by tradition alone, and later by a deeper understanding of tradition's true purpose, not as a rigid boundary that constrains our growth, but as a foundation that supports us as we reach toward ever greater heights." He turned and extended his hand to Naya. "In the woman who stands beside me, Egypt gains not merely a queen but a bridge, between settled and nomadic peoples, between ancient knowledge and fresh insight, between what we have always been and what we might become." Then Naya herself stepped forward, breaking with tradition. "I come before you not as conqueror or supplicant, but as partner in creation. I bring to Egypt the wisdom of stars and open spaces, not to replace your sacred knowledge, but to complement it, not to erase your traditions, but to help them breathe and grow as living things, rather than monuments frozen in stone." Surprisingly, even High Priest Ramesses offered qualified support. The temple astronomers report patterns not seen since the earliest dynasties, alignments our oldest texts associate with periods of remarkable flourishing. Perhaps the gods themselves are indicating that Egypt's path forward requires both the stability of our ancient ways and the vitality of new vision. Later that evening, Kale and Naya made an unprecedented decision to leave the formal palace banquet and join a spontaneous celebration in the marketplace. There, palace musicians played alongside street performers, creating a new sound that honored both traditions while transcending the limitations of each. "This is it, isn't it?" Kyle said softly as they watched Egyptians of all classes mingling freely. "The golden age your cards foretold. Not just prosperity, but a deeper flourishing. A society where differences strengthen rather than divide." "The beginning of it," Naya agreed. "Seeds planted that will grow beyond our lifetime." A shooting star blazed across the heavens above Memphis, a momentary bridge between present and future. For Pharaoh Kale and his nomad queen, the meaning couldn't have been clearer. The path they had chosen, difficult, unprecedented, fraught with challenges, was precisely as the stars themselves had intended. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful new beginning of all. What a journey we've shared. From Naya's bold prophecy to the beautiful union that transformed Egypt, we've witnessed how love and courage can change not just hearts, but entire kingdoms. Which moment touched you most? Was it Kale's marketplace defiance or the tender ceremony beneath the stars? Did you see Ramesses as villain or traditionalist, trying to protect what he believed in? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you find parallels between their struggles and your own life? Have you ever had to choose between convention and heart? Subscribe for more emotional journeys across time and cultures. Turn on notifications and don't miss our previous video, another touching tale that will move you just as deeply. Thank you for traveling with Kyle and Naya, as they proved that sometimes the greatest magic is simply being true to yourself.